Good morning, dear students. Today we're going to talk about story writing. Now, first of all, what is a story? A story tells you about a single event or experience. Of course, it's fictional, it's not true, it's not based on facts, it's just based on something that you write out of your imagination. It has a beginning, middle, and an end. It creates an impression on the reader. It includes all of the parts of a plot, which are the introduction, the conflict, rising action, complication, climax, and resolution. So in class, we've talked about the story mountain, and we talked about how we can develop one event, starting from the introduction, adding to that a conflict, which is, of course, you have taken that in the literature lesson, the types of conflict. There is an inner conflict and an external conflict and so on. And then you talk about, and then you increase the problem and you talk about the rising actions until you reach the climax, and then you solve the problem in the resolution at the end. So you have to follow the story mountain, and these steps should be taken, and you should do that in the plan box before you start writing. What are the main elements of story writing? The first most important element is setting. You can't just start a story without telling the people, or the readers, I mean, who the character, where and when the events are taking place. So you have to describe the setting first. So it tells you the time and place of the events. In order to write a good setting description, you need to study a lot of new vocabulary, powerful vocabulary that helps you describe and write a vivid description of what you want to say. So without the powerful vocabulary, you won't be able to describe the images as vividly as possible. Also, in order to describe a good setting, you need to know how to use figurative language. And figurative language is presented in a different presentation, so I need you please to listen to it carefully. In order also to write a good setting description, you need to know how to use sensory language, which focuses on using your 5 senses so that your writing won't be one-dimensional. It has to be a full experience for the reader. There's also the characterization. When you write your character names, you're not just supposed to write names, you're supposed to show how true the characters are. Show them as if they are real people with distinguishable features. Also, there is the plot. This is what the main events this is what the main story is about. The conflict, you know the types of conflict, and we're going to work on it as well. The climax, resolution, theme. The theme, you know that this is the message that is delivered in the story, and there might be more than one message in the story. Like, for example, themes like friendship, love, hate, war, betrayal, revenge. Any of these could be mentioned or shown in the text in an indirect way, and you're supposed to figure it out. Be careful that the theme most probably is going to be an abstract noun. It's something that you cannot hold. It's like you just said, friendship. You cannot hold friendship. So mostly it's an abstract noun. The point of view of the story can either be first person or third person. And in order to figure this out, you need to look at the feelings and expressions, whose feelings and thoughts are expressed in the story. And that's how you identify it. So let's look at each element separately. First of all, every story needs characters. What are characters? These are people. They could be people. They could be animals, like in story writing for children, or creatures if you're going to write a fantasy. In characterization, what do? It's how we learn about a character. So we learn about them through how they look, how they act, what they do, the way they behave in general shows you more about the character. What they say, how other characters respond to them and feel about them. So all that has to be given to the reader. You cannot just say the name of the character in a list form and that's it. You have to describe the character vividly. Now, there is direct characterization, when the narrator tells you directly about the character. Like, for example, Molly is a brat. Molly is smart. You just say something about the character. And there is also another way, which is an indirect characterization. It shows you a character's traits through their actions or dialogue. Molly came into the kitchen and slammed down her backpack and said, "I don't care what you say. You are not the boss of me, Miss Meanie Pants." So this shows you more about the character, how she speaks, how she behaves. And that technique is called show, don't tell. It's much more fun, of course. Instead of just telling the reader something about the character, you show them. And that way the reader is able to imagine the character more vividly. There is also the setting. And what is the setting? As I told you before, it tells the reader where and when the story takes place. You need to identify the people, places, time, and objects involved. Use sensory details and figurative language to create a vivid picture with your words. In your fiction notes, you're going to find 10 examples of setting description. You need to study the vocabulary used in them and try as much as you can to use it in other setting descriptions. You can use the expression as a whole if you want. You can use the figurative language and try it later on to change it to your own. But use it as a main source for your setting description. It's very useful. Now, what is the plot? It's the series of events through which the writer reveals what is happening to whom and why. Parts of a plot are the introduction, conflict, rising action, complication, which is when we say rising action, we mean the complications, climax, and resolution. Now, look at the story mountain. This is how it goes. You start off with an exposition. Here, you start off with an exposition. You write the background of what happens first, and then you write the rising action, and then you write the climax. This is the worst part of the problem. And then you start solving it using a falling action until you reach the resolution. There is also conflict, and it's the problem in the story that needs to be resolved. In a short story, this will not be too complex. Because of course, if you create a very complex plot, you're going to need a whole book to write about it. Now, great stories have an intriguing conflict, and these conflicts could be man versus nature, man versus society, man versus machine, or man versus himself. A hint about what will happen next is called foreshadowing. Now that's a very important technique. For example, if you hear the Jaws theme music, what comes to your mind is that someone is going to be eaten, for example. So the story sometimes uses some ideas that foreshadow what's going to be happening next. This is a very important technique as well, and you can use it. Short story vocabulary. Now you have to know what a climax is. It's when the action comes to its highest point of conflict, and usually when the story can go either way. So be careful that in the climax part, what's going to come after that is going to be the falling action. And the climax point here is that, let's say it's the highest of them all. It's the highest point of the conflict. It's the part when the story, you feel that the events are the most complicated. You feel that the story won't, or the problem won't be solved. And then after that, and then what comes after that is the resolution. And what leads to the resolution is the falling action. You give the reader a hint first of how the story is going to be solved. So falling action, and then until you reach the resolution. Concerning the theme is the message that the writer intends to communicate by telling the story. What is the point of view? The position of the narrator of the story and what the writer sees from the vantage point. Now, you have to choose whether you are going to write in the first person, third person limited, or third person omniscient. And in any of these cases, they are all correct. You just depend on, you have to plan your story first and see if you're going to write about your own experience, and especially if the task says your experience. In that case, you are forced to write your own point of view, which is the first person. And if the character if the task of the story requires you to write about characters, then in that case you are forced to write in third person. So you have to focus on the task and read it very well and see if you are required to describe your own experience or other characters' experiences. Now look at that. This is one of the most important points about story writing. Now you know that story writing is based on the three most important elements, which are number one, description, events, and dialogue. So in order to write a correct dialogue, you need to know how to use the correct punctuation of it. When you start the punctuation, you should start with the quotation marks and then put the punctuation marks inside. So look at that example for example here. Come here, comma, and then close the quotation marks and make sure that they are not put above each other. This is wrong. You should put the comma first and then close the quotation mark, said Marie. So let's practice. Now look at these two quotations here. The first one says, I slipped and sprained my ankle, responded Nina. Now, what are the words that are actually uttered here by the character? I slipped and sprained my ankle. So you have to start with the quotation marks before I slipped and sprained my ankle. Here, how are you going to end the quotation mark? You should put a comma and then close the quotation marks. And then after responded Nina, you should put a full stop. Now let's look at how it's answered. I slipped and sprained my ankle, comma, close the quotation marks, responded Nina, full stop. Now, you should know that the sentence structure is extremely important, and when you write dialogue, you have to be very careful about the way you punctuate it, because this is going to take away marks from your sentence structure in the exam, in the rubric, okay? So please pay attention. That's all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and you will have to listen to the other presentations to know more about narrative writing. Thank you very much.